standing behind her chair. "It appears he intends us to wait on him. Amelia, see that the goblets are all filled." Ah, it seems the woman had put her foot wrong yet again. Amelia jumped, then gathered her bronze-colored skirts to her knees and went racing for the table where the wine pitchers sat. Badly wrong, it appeared. Harina wondered how long Zaida would continue to allow her to wear dresses rather than trousers, which were much more practical shipboard. It would surely be a shock to her when they passed beyond sight of land and blouses were abandoned. Of the brown Aja, Amelia had wanted to study the Afa-an-Nier, but she was given little time for study. Her purpose was to work, and Zaida saw that she did. She was there to teach the Windfinders all that the Aes Sedai knew. She still dithered over that, but shore-bound instructors, rare as they were, ranked barely a whisker above the deckhands. In the beginning, the woman apparently had believed her dignity fully equal to Zaida's, if not more, and the deckmaster's flail, laid with some frequent regularity across her rump, supposedly was changing her mind, if slowly. Amelia had actually tried to desert 3 times. Strangely, she did not know how to make a gateway, knowledge that carefully was being kept from her, and she should have known she was being watched too closely to bribe her way onto a bumboat. Well, she was unlikely to try again. Reportedly, she'd been told that a 4th attempt would earn a public strapping this time, followed by being hung by her ankles in the rigging. No one would risk that shame, surely. Sail mistresses and even wave mistresses had been reduced to deckhands and gone willingly after that, eager to lose themselves and their disgrace in the mass of men and women hauling lines and handling sail. Removing the cushion from the seat of her chair and dropping it disdainfully on the deck, Harina took her place at the bottom of the left-hand row, Shallon at her back. She was the least senior except for Morale, seated across from her. But then Zaida would have sat only 1 chair farther up had she not gained the 6th fat golden earring for each ear and the chains that connected them. Her lobes might still be sore from the piercings. A pleasant thought. "As he makes us wait, perhaps we should make him wait when he finally does appear." With an untouched goblet in hand, she waved away the anxious Aes Sedai, who scurried over to Morale. Foolish woman. Did she not know she should have served the mistress of the ships first, and then followed with the wave mistresses by seniority? Zaida toyed with her piercework scent box, hanging on a very heavy golden chain around her neck. She wore a wide, close-fitting collar of heavy gold links, too, a gift from Elaine of Andor. "He comes from the Cormor," she said dryly, "whom you were supposed to stick to like a barnacle." Her voice never hardened, but every word cut at Harina. "This man will be as close as I can come to speaking to the Cormor without dire need, since you agreed he did not have to attend me more than 3 times in any period of 2 years. Because of you, I must accept this man's discourtesy if he turns out to be a scabrous drunkard who must run to the rail and empty his stomach every second sentence. The ambassador I send to the Cormor will be someone who knows how to obey her orders." Alana tittered and smirked. She thought everyone was like herself. Shallon squeezed Harina's shoulder reassuringly, but she did not need it. Stay with the Cormor? There was no way she could explain to anyone, even Shallon, Cadswain's rude methods of enforcing her will, or her total lack of respect for Harina's dignity. She had been an ambassador from the Afa-an-Nier in name, and forced to dance to any tune the Aes Sedai piped. She was willing to admit, if only to herself, that she'd almost wept with relief when she realized that cursed woman was going to let her leave. Besides, that girl's visions always came true. So the Aes Sedai said, and they could not lie. It was enough. Durain slipped into the cabin and bowed to Zaida. "The Coromor's emissary has arrived, shipmistress. He stepped out of a gateway on the quarterdeck." That created murmurs among the Windfinders, and Amelia jerked as though she had felt the deckmaster's heel again. "I hope he did not damage your deck too badly, Durain," Zaida said. Harina sipped wine to hide her small smile. Apparently the man was to be made to wait a little at least. Not at all, shipmistress. Touraine sounded surprised. The gateway opened a good foot above the deck, and he stepped through from one of the city's docks. Yes, Shallon whispered. I can see how to do that. She thought anything to do with the power was wonderful. That must have been a shock, seeing a stone dock above your quarterdeck, Zaida said. Very well. I will see whether the Cormor has sent me a scabrous drunkard. Send him in, Touraine, but do not rush. Amelia, am I to get any wine before nightfall? The Aes Sedai gasped, and making little whimpers as if on the point of tears, rushed to fetch a goblet as Touraine bowed and left. What had Amelia done? Long moments passed, and Zaida had her wine well before a large man with dark hair curling to his broad shoulders entered the cabin. He certainly was not scabrous, nor did he appear drunk. The high collar of his black coat held a silver pin in the shape of a sword on one side, and on the other a red and gold pin shaped like one of the creatures that entwined the Cormor's forearms. A dragon. Yes, that was what it was called. A round pin fastened to his left shoulder showed 3 golden crowns against blue enamel. A sigil, perhaps? Was he a shore-bound noble? Could the Cormor actually have done Zaida honor in sending this man? Knowing Rand al'Thor as she did, she doubted it had been intentional. It was not that he tried to dishonor anyone, yet he cared little for the honors of others. He bowed to Zaida, handling the sword at his side smoothly, but he failed to touch heart and lips and forehead. Still, some shortcomings had to be overlooked with the shorebound. I apologize if I arrived late, shipmistress, he said, but it seemed unnecessary to come before all of your number were here. You must have a very good-looking glass to have observed that from the docks. Studying him up and down with a frown, Zaida sipped her wine. You have a name? I'm Logain, he said simply. Half the women in the room exhaled sharply, and most of the rest let their jaws drop. More than one slopped wine from her goblet. Not Zaida and not Harina, but the others. Logain. That was a name known even to the Afa-Anmier. May I speak, shipmistress? Amelia asked breathily. She was clutching the porcelain pitcher so hard that Harina feared it might shatter in her hands, but the woman had learned enough sense to say no more until Zaida nodded. Then words spilled from her in a breathless rush. This man was a false dragon. He was gentled for it. How it is he can channel again, I cannot know, but he channels Saidin. Saidin! He is tainted, shipmistress. If you deal with him, you will incur the wrath of the White Tower. I know enough, Zaida cut in. You should be well aware by now how much I fear the wrath of the White Tower. But Zaida held up a single finger, and the Aes Sedai's mouth snapped shut, her lips twisting in a sickly fashion. That one word might lead to her kissing the deckmaster's sister again, and she knew it. What she says is true in part, Logain said calmly. I am an Ashaman, but there is no taint any longer. Saidin is clean. The Creator decided to show us mercy, it seems. I have a question for her. Whom do you serve, Aes Sedai? Egwene Al'Vir or Elida Arroyan? Wisely, Amelia kept her mouth shut. For the next year, she serves me, Logain, Zaida said firmly. The Aes Sedai squeezed her pale eyes shut for a moment, and when they opened again, they were even wider than before, impossible as that seemed, and they held a look of horror. Was it possible she had believed Zaida might relent and let her go early? You can confine your questions to me, the shipmistress went on. But first I have 2 for you. Where is the Cormor? I must send an ambassador to him, and he must keep her close in accordance with the bargain. Remind him of that. And what message do you bring from him? A request for some service, I suppose. As to where he is, I cannot say. The man smiled slightly, as if he had made a joke. He smiled. "I demand," Zaida began, but he cut her off, provoking angry mutters and hot glares from the other women. The fool seemed to think he was an equal to the mistress of the ships. "He wants his whereabouts kept secret for now, shipmistress. The Forsaken have made efforts to kill him. I am willing to take Karina din Togara with me, however. From what I heard, I think he found her acceptable." Karina jerked so hard she spilled wine over the back of her hand, then took another long swallow. But no, Zaida would divorce Amel and marry a ballast stone before she sent Karina din Togara as her ambassador. Still, even the thought of it was enough to make her tongue stick to the roof of her mouth. Even becoming mistress of the ships might be insufficient recompense for being forced to endure Cadswain any longer. Studying Logain with a stony face, Zaida told Amelia to pour wine for him. The Aes Sedai flinched, and by the time she reached the table she was trembling so hard the pitcher's spout clattered on the rim of the goblet. Almost as much wine went onto the deck as inside the goblet. Strangely, Logain walked over to her and put his hands on hers to steady her. Was he one of those who could not leave others to do their own work? "You've nothing to fear from me, Amelia Sedai," he told her. "It's been a long time since I ate anyone for breakfast." She stared up at him with her mouth hanging open as though uncertain whether he was making a joke. "And the service he requests?" Zaida said. "Not a request, shipmistress." He had to straighten the pitcher to keep the goblet from overflowing. Taking the goblet, he stepped away from Amelia, but she stood gaping at his back. Light, but the woman found no end of ways to get into trouble. "A call on your side of the bargain with the Cormor. Among other things, you promised him ships, and he needs ships to carry food and other supplies to Bandar Eben from Ilion and Tyr." "That can be done," Zaida said, not quite masking her relief, though she shot a frown at Harina. Helena glared as well, of course, but so did Lasine and Niala and several others. Harina suppressed a sigh. Some of the details of the bargain were quite close, she had to admit, such as the requirement that the mistress of the ships be prepared to attend him up to 3 times in any 2 years. The Jendai prophecy said the Atha Anir were to serve the Coromor, yet few opinions of how they were to serve included the mistress of the ships going running when called. But the others had not been there, bargaining with Aes Sedai, convinced that she had no alternative to making whatever bargain she could. Truth of the light, it was a wonder she had gotten as much as she had. "Supplies for more than 1 million people, shipmistress," Logain added as casually as if he were asking for another goblet of wine. "How many more I cannot say, but Bandar Eben itself is starving. The ships must arrive as soon as possible." Shock rippled through the cabin. Harina was not alone in taking a long drink of wine. Even Zaida's eyes widened in amazement. "That might require more rakers than we possess," she said at last, unable to keep the incredulity from her voice. Logain shrugged as though that were of no account. "Even so, that is what he requires of you. Use other ships if you must." Zaida stiffened in her chair. Required. Bargain or no bargain, that was imprudent language to use with her. Touraine slipped into the cabin again, and in breach of all protocol, ran to Zaida, her bare feet slushing the deck. Bending close, she whispered into the shipmistress's ear. Zaida's face slowly took on a look of horror. She half raised her scent box, then shuddered and let it fall to her bosom. "Send her in," she said. "Send her in immediately." "There is news to make an anchor weep," she went on, as Touraine raced from the cabin. "I will let you hear it from she who brought it. You must wait," she added when Logain opened his mouth. "You must wait." He had sufficient sense to hold his peace, but not enough to hide his impatience, stalking to the side of the cabin to stand with his mouth tight and his brows drawn down. The young woman who entered and bowed deeply to Zaida was tall and lean. She might have been lovely, except that her face was haggard. Her blue linen blouse and shoulders looked as if they'd been worn for days, and she swayed on her feet with weariness. Her honor chain held only a handful of medallions, as befitted her youth, yet Harina could see that no fewer than 3 commended acts of great courage. "I am Sir Din Salon Long-Eyes, shipmistress," she said hoarsely. "Sail mistress of the Darter Wind Racer. I sailed as fast as I could, but I fear it is too late for anything to be done. I stopped at every island between Tremalking and here, but I was always too late." Tears began to trickle down her cheeks, yet she seemed unaware of them. "Tell the first 12 your sad news in your own way, at your own pace," Zaida said gently. "Amelia, give her wine." Not gently said at all. The Aes Sedai leaped to obey. "Almost 3 weeks ago," Samela said, "Amayar on Tremalking began asking the gift of passage to every island. Always a man and a woman to each island. Those for Isla Somera requested they be put off in boats out of sight of land when they were told that the Shonshan holds all of Somera." She took a full goblet from Amelia, nodding her thanks, then drank deeply. Harina exchanged questioning glances with Moreo, who shook her head slightly. No Amayar had ever requested the gift of passage in Harina's memory, though for them it truly was a gift, with no gift expected in return. And they avoided the salt, keeping their small fishing boats close to shore. So asking to be put off out of sight of land was as strange as asking passage. But what could be so dire in this? All of the Amayar in the ports left, even those owed money from the shipyards or the rope walks, but no one thought anything of it for 2 or 3 days. The wine had not wet Samela's throat enough to mitigate her hoarseness. She scrubbed at the tears on her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Not until we realized none had come back. The governor sent people to the Amayar villages, and they found," she squeezed her eyes shut, "the Amayar were all dead or dying. Men, women," her voice broke, "children." Funeral keening rose in the cabin, and Harina was surprised to realize that shrill sound was coming from her mouth too. Sad enough to make an anchor weep? This should make the heavens sob. No wonder the sail mistress was hoarse. How many hours, how many days had she cried since learning of this catastrophe? "How?" Polana demanded when the keening died. Face distraught, she leaned forward in her chair. She was holding her scent box to her nose, as if the scent could somehow ward off the stench of this news. "Some sickness? Speak, woman." "Poison, wave mistress," Samela replied. She struggled to compose herself, but tears still leaped down her face. "Everywhere I have been, it was the same. They gave their children a poison that put them into a deep sleep from which they did not waken. It seems there was not enough of that to go around, so many of the adults took slower poison. Some lived long enough to be found and tell the tale. The great hand on
Hey, executive session, how you doing?
Stood reportedly is now a deep hollow.
I'm just rolling up a couple doobies.
That spoke of the hand, and when it was destroyed, they believed this signaled the end of time, what they called the end of illusion. They believed it was time for them to leave this illusion. She laughed the word bitterly. We call the world. Have none been saved? Zaida asked. None at all? Tears glistened on her cheeks too, but Harina could not fault her on that. Her own cheeks were wet. None, shipmistress. Zaida stood, and tears or no tears, she held the aura of command, and her voice was steady. The fastest ships must be sent to every island, even to those of Isla Somera. A way must be found. When the salt
popcorn
buds, after the breaking, the Amayar asked our protection from brigands and raiders, and we owe them protection still. If we can find only a handful who still live, we still owe it. This is as sad a story as I have ever heard. Logain's voice sounded too loud as he walked back out in front of Zaida. But your ships are committed to Bandar Eden. If you don't have enough rakers, then you must use your other fast ships too. All of them, if necessary. Are you mad? As well as heartless? Zaida demanded. Fists on her hips and feet apart, she seemed to be standing on a quarterdeck. Her glare stabbed at Logain. We must mourn. We must save who we can, and mourn for the countless thousands we cannot save. She might as well have smiled for all the effect her glares had on Logain. As he spoke, it seemed to Harina that the space turned chill and the light dimmed. She was not the only woman to hug herself against that cold. Mourn if you must, he said, but mourn on the march for Tarmangaiden. Chapter 23. Call to a Sitting. With Magla and Salita out for the morning, Ramanda had the patched brown tent to herself, a blessed opportunity to read, though the two mismatched brass lamps on the small table gave off a faint yet nose-wrinkling scent of rancid oil. One had to live with such things these days. Some might consider the flame, the blade, and the heart unseemly for one of her attainments and position. As a girl in Farmading, she had been forbidden such books, but it made an agreeable change from dry histories and terrifying reports of food spoilage. She had seen a side of beef kept for months as fresh as the day the cow was slaughtered, but now the keepings were failing one by one. Some had taken to muttering that there must be a flaw in Egwene's creation, yet that was arrant blather. If a weave worked once, then properly done it always worked, barring something to disrupt the weave, and Egwene's new weaves always worked as claimed. She had to give the woman that. And try as they might, and they had tried very hard, no one could detect any interference. It was as if Sidar itself were failing.
With my
It was unthinkable and inescapable.
my little toke
Worst
stove.
of all, no one could think of anything to do. She certainly could not.
One second, I'll light that up.
Tales of romance and adventure was much preferable to contemplating utter futility
My
and the failure of
nice
what
little
was
cleaning
by its
tray
very
that
nature
a lot of people I
unfair.
know keep wanting to steal it from me.
The novice straightening the tent had sense enough not to comment on her reading, or to glance at the wood-bound book twice. Bodawin Coffin was quite pretty, but she was an intelligent girl even so, though she had something of her brother around the eyes, and rather more of him in her head than she was willing to admit. Undoubtedly, she was already hard on the path to the green, or perhaps the blue. The girl wanted to live adventure, not just read about it, as if an Aes Sedai's life would not bring her more adventure than she wished without searching for it. Ramonda felt no regret over the girl's path. The yellow would have plenty to choose from among more suitable novices. There could be no question of accepting any of the older women, of course, yet that left a wealth of choice. She tried to focus on the page. She did enjoy the story of Birgitta and Geidel Kane. The tent was not particularly large, and was quite crowded. It
There we
held a
go.
trio of hard canvas cots, barely softened by thin mattresses stuffed with lumpy wool, 3 ladder-back chairs made by distinctly different hands, a rickety washstand with a cracked mirror and a chipped blue pitcher standing in the white basin, and along the table, made steady by a small block of wood under one leg, brass-bound chests for clothing, bed linens, and personal possessions. As a sitter, she could have had the space to herself, but she liked being able to keep a close eye on Magla and Salita. Just because they all sat for the yellow was no reason to trust too far. Magla supposedly was her ally in the hall, yet went her own way much too often, and Salita seldom did anything else. Still, it
The
made for
papers I
inconvenience
used.
aside from crowding. Bodawin had a great deal of work, mainly putting away the dresses and slippers Salita scattered across the tattered carpets after deciding they would not do. That woman was frivolous enough for a green. She went through her entire wardrobe every
And
single morning. Likely she thought Ramonda would have her serving woman straighten. She always seemed as much in her service as Ramonda's. But Elmara had served Ramonda for years before she went into retirement, not to mention helping her escape Farmading after a slight misunderstanding a short time later. There was no possibility she would require Elmara to look after another sister as well as herself. She frowned at the book, not seeing a word. Why in the light had Magla insisted on Salita back in Saladar? In truth, Magla had bandied several names about, each more ridiculous than the last. but had settled on Salita once she decided the plump tyrant had the best chance of being
Yeah, I've
raised
tried
to a
rice
chair.
papers.
Romanda had thrown her own support behind Dagdara, a far more suitable candidate, not to mention one she thought she could sway without too much difficulty. Yet she herself had been trying for a chair while Magla already held one. That carried weight. And no matter that Romanda had previously held a chair longer than anyone in living memory, well, it was done, and
These
that was
are
that.
rice papers.
What could not be
And
cured must be endured. Nisa into the tent, the light of Sidar around her winking out as she did so. In the brief moment before the tent flap fell shut, her bald-headed stump of a warrior inside, a hand resting on his sword hilt, and his head swiveling, plainly standing guard. "May I speak with you alone?" the diminutive sister said. Short enough to make Saren seem tall, she always minded Rolanda of a large-eyed sparrow. There was nothing tiny about her powers of observation or her intellect, however.
then I
She'd
got
been a
some,
natural choice for the council the
well,
Ajahs
I
created,
consider them old school papers.
and it was certainly no fault of hers that said council had had little or no restraining effect on the woman. "Of course, Nisal." Romanda casually closed the book and eased up to tuck it beneath the yellow tasseled cushion on her chair.
Yeah, rice.
It
I
would
like
better
rice
do to have
papers too,
worked
just
out while
'cause
she was reading that.
you get a
"It
cleaner
must be almost
taste.
time for your next class, Bodwin. You don't want to be late." "Oh no," I said. "Sharina would be very upset." Spreading her white skirts in a deep curtsy, the novice darted from the tent.
And then, of course, I
Romanda
got
pressed her lips. Sharina would be upset. That woman was emblematic of all that was wrong with allowing those above 18 into the novice ranks. Her potential was beyond incredible, but that was beside the point. Sharina Malloy was a disruption. But how to be rid of her? Her and all the other women too old to have had their names written in the novice book in the first place. Provisions were strictly limited for putting a woman out once her name was in a book. Unfortunately, over the years, a number of women had been found to have lied about their age to gain entrance to the tower. By a few years only in most cases, but allowing them to remain had set precedents, and Egwene Alvir had set another, and much more. There had to be some way to overcome it. "May I make us private?" Nisal asked.
I like the
"If you
toadstones
wish.
just 'cause
Have you
they
learned
keep your
something
hands
about the
clean.
negotiations?" Despite Egwene's capture, talks continued under the pavilion at the foot of the bridge in Darine. Or rather, the semblance of talks. They were a farce, a dumb show of obstinacy. Yet it was necessary to keep a close eye on the negotiators. Varilyn had snatched most of that work to herself, claiming Grey Aja prerogative. But Magla found ways to wriggle into the matter whenever she could, and so did Soroya and Takima and Faisella. Worse than the fact that none of them seemed to trust the others to carry out the negotiations, or much at all, for that matter. At times, all of them almost seemed to be negotiating for Elida. Well, perhaps it was not that bad. They held fast against the woman's ridiculous demand that the Blue Aja be dissolved, and argued, if not nearly with sufficient force, for Elida stepping down. But if she and Lilane, she was forced to admit, did not stiffen their backbones now and then, they might well accede to some of Elida's other odious conditions. Light. At times it was as if they had forgotten the entire purpose of marching on Tarvalon. "Pour us tea," she went on, gesturing to a painted wooden tray sitting atop two stacked chests that held a silver pitcher and several battered pewter cups. "And tell me what you've heard." The glow surrounded Nisal briefly while she warded and tied off the weave. "I know nothing of the negotiations," she said, filling two of the cups. "I want to ask you to speak to Lilane." Romanda took the proffered cup and used taking a slow swallow to give herself time for thought. At least this tea had not yet turned. Lilane. What could there be about Lilane that required warding? Still, anything that gave her
The
less
ones I
than
used to
the other
like,
woman
there were
would
the
be
rice
useful.
papers, were
Lilane seemed entirely too smugly
elements.
for her to be entirely comfortable about.
Those used to be pretty good.
She shifted on the seat cushion. "Regarding what? Why don't you speak to her yourself? We haven't fallen as low as it seems the White Tower has under Elida." "I have spoken to her. Or rather, she has spoken to me, and rather forcefully." Nisao sat down and set her cup on the table while she arranged her yellow slashed skirts with overly elaborate care.
Excuse me.
She wore a small frown. It seemed she was fiddling for time, too. Lillian demanded that I stop asking questions about
Excuse
Anaya
me.
and Chiron, she said finally. According to her, their murders are Blue Aja business. Romanda snorted, shifting again. The book's wooden cover was a hard lump beneath her, its corners digging into her hip. That is utter nonsense. But why were you asking questions? I don't recall you being inquisitive about such matters. The other woman touched her cup to her lips, but if she drank, it was the tiniest sip. Lowering the cup, she almost seemed to grow taller. She sat up so straight. A sparrow becoming a hawk. Because the mother ordered me to. Ramada kept her eyebrows from rising only with an effort. So, in the beginning, she had accepted Egwene for the same reason she suspected every other sitter had. Certainly Lelaine had done so, once she realized she could not attain the stolen staff herself. A malleable young girl would be a puppet in the hands of the Hall, and Ramada had fully intended to be the one pulling her strings. Later it had seemed obvious that Swan was the true puppeteer, and there had been no way to stop her short of rebelling against a second Amerlin, which surely would have shattered the rebellion against Elida. She hoped Lelaine had ground her teeth over that half as much as she had. Now Egwene was in Elida's hands, yet in several meetings she had remained cool and collected, determined in her course of action and that of the sisters outside Tar Valon's walls. Ramanda found in herself a grudging respect for the girl. Very grudging, but she could not deny it. It was Egwene herself. The Hall kept a tight fist on the dream Terangrial, and though no one could find the one Leanna had been loaned before that dire night, she and Swan had been practically at one another's throats. There was no question of Swan slipping into Tel Aranriod to tell the woman what to say. Was it possible that she could reach the same conclusion about her without seeing her in the unseen world? That counsel had stuck very close to her. That is reason enough for you, Misao? She could hardly slip the book back out without the other woman noticing. She shifted again, but there was no comfortable position on the thing. She was going to have a bruise if this continued. Misao twisted her pewter cup about on the tabletop, but she still did not look away. It is my major reason. In the beginning, I thought she would end up as your pet, or Lilaine's. Later, when it was clear she had evaded both of you, I thought Swan must be holding the leash. But I soon learned I was wrong. Swan has been a teacher, I'm sure, and an advisor, and perhaps even a friend. But I've seen Egwene call her up short. No one has a leash on Egwene Alvier. She is intelligent, observant, quick to learn, and deft. She may become one of the great Amerlins. The bird-like sister gave a sudden brief laugh. Do you realize? She will be the longest-sitting Amerlin in history. No one will ever live long enough to top her, unless she chooses to step down early. Smiles faded to solemnity, and perhaps worry. Not because she had skirted the edge of violating custom, however. Nisao schooled her face well, but her eyes were tight. If we managed to unseat Elida, that is. Hearing her own thoughts thrown back at her with emendations was unnerving. A great
Hey,
Amerlin?
Chris Summers, how you doing?
It would take many years to see whether
I'm
that
not
would
sure
happen.
yet.
But whether or not Egwene managed that
I gotta be able to,
considerable and unlikely feat,
what you
she
call
would
it, get
discover
hold
that
of
the
some
Hall
more
was
soil.
much less amenable once her war powers expired. Romantic Cassin certainly
I
would
haven't
be.
had
Respect
been
was
able to
one
get the
thing,
funds together to
becoming
be
a
able to
lapdog quite another.
get the soil that
Standing
me
on
and
the pretext of straightening
my
her
brother
yellow
need.
skirts, she drew the book from beneath the cushion as she sat back down and tried to drop it surreptitiously. It hit the carpet with a thud, and Misao's eyebrows twitched.
Not being able to find works kind of
pulling the
sucks.
book under the edge of the table with her foot. We will.
At least
She
work
put more
that pays under
confidence
the
than she
table.
felt into that. The peculiar negotiations and Egwene's continuing imprisonment gave her pause. Forget the girl's claims that she could undermine Elida from within. Though it seemed half her work had been done by others, if her reporting on the situation in the tower was accurate. But Ramonda believed because she had to believe. She had no intention of living cut off from her Aja, accepting penance and the light of
everything has a way of working out.
Again.
Not the best
No
roller, but
intention of accepting Elida Arroyhan
it
as
works.
Lorelei. Better Lelaine than that. And one argument in her own mind for raising Egwene had been that it kept the stolen staff from Lelaine. No doubt Lelaine had thought the same concerning
Something
her.
eventually always works out.
And I will
I'm not
inform
too
Lelaine
worried.
in no uncertain terms that you can ask any questions you wish. We must solve those murders, and the murder of any sister is every sister's concern. What have you learned so far? Not a proper question, perhaps, but being a sitter gave you certain privileges. At least, she had always believed it did. Nisao displayed no
I like
questioned,
my little toadstone. Watch, I'll be right back. I got another one. I just gotta go get it.
It seemed there must be some link between Anaya and Kyra. Some reason they two were picked out. But all I've learned so far is that they had been close friends for many years. Blues called them and another Blue sister, Cabriana McCandis, the Three, because they were so close. But they were all close-mouthed, too. No one recalls any of them talking about their own affairs, except with each other. In any event, friendship seems a feeble motive for murder. I hope I can find some reason why anyone would want to murder them, especially a man who can channel, but I confess it's a small hope. Ramonda furrowed her brow. Cabriana McCandis. She paid little attention to the other Ajas. Only the yellow had any truly useful function. How could any of their passions compare to healing? Yet that name chimed a small gong in the back of her head. Why? It would come to her, or not. It could not be important. Small hopes can grow surprising fruit, Nisao. That's an old saying in farmatting, and it's true. Continue your investigation. In Egwene's absence, you may report what you learned to me. Nisao blinked, and her jaw tightened briefly. But whether or not reporting to Ramonda sat well with her, there was little she could do but obey. She could hardly claim interference in her affairs. Murder could not be one sister's affair.
That's that one with
Besides, Magla might have gotten her
that's this one.
For the third yellow sitter.
And the one I'm smoking right now is
for herself easily. After all, she had been head of the yellow before she retired, and even Magla had been unwilling to stand against her.
the one I'm smoking now is a Juicy J.
Much less power than she would have liked, but at least she could count on obedience in most things. From yellow sisters, if not sitters at least. As Nisao untied her ward against eavesdropping and let it dissipate, Theodrin popped into the tent. She was wearing her shawl.
I went to go get my other little toadstone.
As newly raised sisters often did. The willowy Damani had chosen brown after
pretty much
granted her that
like
shawl,
this, but this is an older one.
Her, despite finally accepting her. They'd seemed ready to largely ignore her, entirely the wrong thing, so Ramonda had taken her in. Theodrin tried to behave.
Yeah, usually Juicy J's are the number one flavored ones.
She spread her brown woolen skirts in a curtsy. A small curtsy, but a curtsy.
Right.
She was well aware that she had no right to the shawl.
Definitely know your pothead when you could call the papers.
It would have been cruel not to make sure she understood. Lelaine has called the sitting of the hall, she said breathlessly. I couldn't find out why. I ran to tell you, but I didn't want to intrude while the ward was up. And rightly not, Ramonda said. Nisao, if you will excuse me, I must see what Lelaine is about. Gathering her yellow-fringed shawl from atop one of the chests holding her clothing, she arranged it over her arms and checked her hair in the cracked mirror before herding the others outside and seeing them on their way. It was not so much that she thought Nisao would have looked for what had made that thud if left in the tent alone, and she was certain Theodrin would not. But it was taking chances. Aelmara would replace the book where it belonged, with several similar volumes in the chest that held Ramonda's personal possessions. That had a very stout lock with only 2 keys, one kept in her belt pouch, the other in Aelmara's. The morning was crisp, yet spring had arrived with a rush. The dark clouds massing behind Dragon Mount's shattered peak would deliver rain rather than snow, though not on the camp, it was to be hoped. Many of the tents leaked, and the camp streets were a bog already. Horse carts making deliveries splashed mud from their high wheels as they made new ruts, driven by women for the most part, and a few gray-haired men. Male access to the Aes Sedai camp was strictly limited now. Even so, nearly every sister she saw glided along the uneven wooden walkways wrapped in the light of Saidar, and prepared by her warder if she had one. Romonda refused to embrace the source whenever she
And you
went
can smoke them
outside.
down pretty good.
Someone had to set an example of proper behavior, with every sister in the camp on tenterhooks, yet she was very conscious of the lack. Conscious of the lack of a warder, too. Keeping most men out of the camp was all very well, but a murderer was unlikely to pay any heed to the restriction. Down the street, Gareth Bryn rode out of a crossing street, a stocky man with mostly grey hair, his breastplate strapped over a buff-colored coat, and his helmet hanging from his saddle-bow. Swan was with him, swaying on a plump, shaggy mare, and looking such a pretty girl that it was almost possible to forget she had been hard-bitten and sharp-tongued as Amelin. Easy to forget she was still an accomplished schemer.
Pop it
Blues
out.
always were. The mare plodded along, but Swan nearly fell off before Bryn reached out to steady her. At the edge of the blue quarters, the camp was laid out in rough approximation of the Aja quarters in the tower. He dismounted long enough to help her down, then climbed back into his bay's saddle,
pop it out,
and left her standing there, holding
that's
the mare
about what you're left with.
and gazing after him.
Enough to put away for when you don't have any.
Blacking the man's boots, doing his laundry. That relationship was abhorrent.
Excuse me.
The Blue should put an end to it, and to the pit of doom with custom. However strong, custom should not be abused to hold all Aes Sedai up to ridicule. Turning her back on Swan, she started toward the pavilion that served as their temporary hall of the tower. As pleasant as it was to meet in the true hall, not to mention under Elida's very nose, few sisters could manage to put themselves to sleep at any hour, so the pavilion must continue to serve. She glided along the walkway without haste. She was not about to be seen hurrying to answer Lelane's call. What could the woman want now? A gong sounded, magnified with the power so it carried across the camp clearly, another of Sharina's suggestions, and suddenly the walkways were crowded with novices hurrying to their next class or to chores, all clustered by family. Those families of 6 or 7 always attended class together, did chores together, in fact did everything together. It was an effective way to manage so many novices. Nearly 50 more had wandered into the camp in just the last 2 weeks, pushing the total back near 1,000 in spite of runaways, and almost a quarter of those were young enough to be proper novices, more than the tower had held in centuries. Yet she wished it were not Sharina's work. The woman had not even suggested it to the mistress of novices. She'd organized the thing herself and presented it to Tiana whole and complete. The novices, some of them graying or with lines in their faces, so that it was difficult to think of them as children despite their white dresses, squeezed to the edge of the walkway to let sisters pass while they offered curtsies, but none stepped into the muddy street to make more room. Sharina again. Sharina had spread the word that she did not want to see the girls dirtying their nice white woolens unnecessarily. It was enough to make Romonda grind her teeth. The novices who curtsied to her straightened hurriedly and practically ran. Ahead of her, she spotted Sharina herself, talking to Tiana, who was shrouded in the glow of Saidar, doing all of the talking, with Tiana merely nodding now and then. There was nothing disrespectful in Sharina's demeanor, but despite novice white, with her creased face and gray hair and a tight bun on the back of her head, she looked exactly what she was, a grandmother. And Tiana had an unfortunately youthful appearance. Something about her bone structure and large brown eyes overwhelmed the ageless look of Aes Sedai. Lack of disrespect or no, there was too much appearance of a woman instructing her granddaughter to suit Ramonda. As she approached them, Sharina offered a proper curtsy. A very proper curtsy, Ramonda had to admit, and hurried off the other way to join her own family, waiting for her. Were there fewer lines in her face than there had been? Well, there was no saying what might happen when a woman began with the power at her age. 67, and a novice. Is she giving you difficulties? She asked, and Tiana leaped as though an icicle had slid down the back of her dress. The woman lacked the dignity, the gravity necessary in a mistress of novices. At times she seemed smothered by the number of her charges, too, and she was much too lenient besides, accepting excuses where there could be none. She recovered quickly, however, falling in beside Ramonda, though she smoothed her dark gray skirts unnecessarily. Difficulties? Of course not. Sharina is the best behaved novice in the book. Truth to tell, most are well behaved. The greatest number sent to my study are mothers upset because their daughters are learning faster than they, or have a higher potential, or aunts with the same complaint of nieces. They seem to believe the matter can be rectified somehow. They can be surprisingly adamant about it until I set them straight about being adamant with any sister. Although a good many have been sent to me more than once, I fear. A handful still seem surprised that they can be switched. Is that so? Ramonda said absently. Her eye had caught pale-haired Delana hurrying in the same direction, gray-fringed shawl looped over her arms, and her so-called secretary striding at her side. Delana wore an almost somber dark gray, but the Saranoff trollop was in blue/green silk that left half her bosom on display and fit much too snugly over hips that she rolled blatantly. Of late, the pair of them seemed to have abandoned the story that Halima was merely Delana's servant. Indeed, the woman was gesturing emphatically while Delana merely nodded in the meekest manner imaginable. Meek! It was always a mistake to choose a pillow friend who did not wear the shawl, especially if you were fool enough to let her take the lead. Sharina isn't only well behaved, Tiana continued blithely. She is showing a great skill with Nynaeve's new way of healing. Like a number of the older novices, most were village wise women of one sort or another, though I don't see how that can have any bearing. One was a noble in Murundi. Ramonda tripped over her own heel and staggered 2 paces, arms flailing for balance before she could catch herself and gather her shawl. Tiana put a hand on her arm to steady her, murmuring about the unevenness of the walkway's planking, but she shook it off. Sharina had a gift for the new healing? And a number of the older women? She herself had learned the new way, but while it was different enough from the old that the second learned weave limitation seemed not to apply, she had no great gift for it. Not nearly what she had for the old method. And why are novices being allowed to practice that, Tiana? Tiana flushed, as well she should. Such weaves were much too complex for novices, not to mention dangerous if misapplied. Done improperly, healing could kill rather than cure. The woman channeling as well as the patient. I can hardly stop them from seeing healing done, Ramonda, she said defensively, moving her arms as if adjusting a shawl she was not wearing. There are always broken bones or some fool who's managed to cut himself badly, not to mention all the illness we've had to deal with lately. Most of the older women only have to see a weave once to have it down. Abruptly, for a bare instant, red returned to her cheeks. Smoothing her face, she drew herself up, and defensiveness fell away from her voice. In any event, Ramonda, I shouldn't need to remind you that the novices and accepted are mine. As mistress of novices, I decide what they can learn and when. Some of those women could test for accepted today after only months, when it comes to the power at least. If I choose not to make them twiddle their thumbs idly, it is my decision to make. Perhaps you should run see whether Sharina has any further instructions for you, Ramonda said coldly. Spots of crimson staining her cheeks, Tiana turned on her heel and strode away without another word. Not quite forbidden rudeness, but close. Even from behind she was the image of indignation, her back stiff as an iron rod, her steps quick. Well, Ramonda was willing to admit she'd come near rudeness herself, but with cause. Trying to put the mistress of novices out of her mind, she set out toward the pavilion again, but had to restrain herself to keep from walking as fast as Tiana. Sharina. And several of the other older women. Should she rethink her position? No, of course not. Their names should never have been allowed in the novice book in the first place. Yet their names were there, and it seemed they had mastered this wonderful new healing. Oh, it was a tangled snarl. She did not want to think about it. Not now. The pavilion stood at the heart of the camp, a much patched piece of heavy canvas surrounded by a walkway 3 times as wide as any of the others. Holding her skirts well up out of the mud, she hurried across to it. She did not mind haste when it got her out of the mud more quickly. Even so, Elmara would have a time cleaning her shoes and her petticoats, she thought as she let her skirts down, decently concealing her ankles once more. Word of the hall sitting always drew sisters hoping for news of the negotiations or of Egwene, and a good 50 or more were already gathered around the pavilion with their warders, or standing just inside, behind where their sitters would sit. Even here, most shone with the light of the power, as if they were in any danger, surrounded by other Aes Sedai. She found herself with a strong urge to walk around the pavilion, boxing ears. That was impossible, of course. Even if custom could be set aside, which she had no desire to do, a chair in the hall gave no authority for such a thing. Shiriam, the narrow blue stole of the keeper vivid on her shoulders, stood out in the crowd, in part because there was a clear space around her. Other sisters were avoiding looking at her, much less approaching her. The flame-haired woman embarrassed many of the sisters, appearing every time the hall was called to sit as she did. The law was quite clear. Any sister could attend a sitting of the hall unless it was closed, yet the Amerlin could not enter the hall of the tower without being announced by the keeper, and the keeper was not allowed in without the Amerlin. Shiriam's green eyes were tight, as usual, and she fidgeted in an unbecoming manner, like a novice who knew she was due another visit to the mistress of novices. At least she was not embracing the source, and her warder was nowhere in sight. Before stepping beneath the pavilion, Ramonda glanced over her shoulder and sighed. The great bulk of black clouds behind Dragonmount was gone, not drifting apart, simply gone entirely. Very likely there would be another wave of panic among the grooms and laborers and the serving women. Surprisingly, the novices seemed to take these strange occurrences more in stride. Perhaps that was because they were trying to take their cues from the sisters, but she suspected Sharina's hand again. What was she to do about the woman? Inside, 18 cloth-covered boxes, colored for the 6 Ajas represented in the camp, made platforms for polished benches, 2 slanting rows atop the layered carpets, widening toward a box covered with stripes in all 7 colors. Wisely, Egwene had insisted on including red, despite considerable opposition. Where Elida seemed determined to divide every Aja from every other, Egwene was determined to hold them all together, including the red. The wooden bench atop that platform had the Amerlin's 7-striped stole laid across it. No one claimed responsibility for placing it there, but no one had removed it either. Ramonda was uncertain whether it was meant to be a reminder of Egwene Alvir, the Amerlin's seat, an echo of her presence, or a reminder that she was absent and a prisoner. How it was seen, doubtless, depended on the sister looking. She was not the only sitter taking her time to answer Lelane's call. Delana was there, of course, slumped on her bench and rubbing the side of her nose, her watery blue eyes pensive. Once, Ramonda had considered her level-headed. Unsuitable for a chair, but level-headed. At least she had not allowed Halima to follow her into the hall and continue her harangue. Or rather, at least Halima had chosen not to. No one who had heard the woman shouting at Delana possessed any doubts who gave the orders there. Lelaine herself was already on her bench, just below the Amerlins, a slender, hard-eyed woman in blue-slashed silk who rationed her smiles tightly, which made it doubly odd that now and then she glanced toward the 7-colored stole and gave a small smile. That smile made Ramonda uneasy, and few things could do that. Moria, in blue wool embroidered with silver, was striding up and down in front of the blue-covered platforms. Was her frown because she knew why Lelaine had called the hall and disapproved, or because she was worried over not knowing? "I saw Mirelle walking with Hugh," Malinde said, hitching up her green-fringed shawl as Ramonda entered the pavilion, "and I don't think I've ever seen a sister looking so harassed." Despite the sympathy in her tone, her eyes sparkled and her full lips quirked with amusement. "How did you ever talk her into bonding him? I was there when someone suggested it to her, and I vow she turned pale. The man could almost pass for an ogier. I expressed myself forcefully on duty." Faisella, stocky and square-faced, was forceful in everything. In truth, a hammer of a woman. She mocked every tale of seductive Damani. "I pointed out that Clew had been becoming more and more dangerous to himself and others since Chiron died, and I told her it couldn't be allowed to continue. I made her see that, as the only sister ever to save two other warders in the same circumstances, she was the only choice to try doing it again. I'll admit I had to twist her arm a little, but eventually she saw the right of the matter." "How under the light could you twist Mirelle's arm?" Malinde leaned forward eagerly. Ramonda passed them by. How could anyone have twisted Mirelle's arm? No gossip. Janya was on her bench for the brown, squinting in thought. At least she was squinting, but the woman always seemed to be thinking of something else, even when she was talking to you. Maybe her eyes were bad. The rest of the benches still stood empty, though. Ramonda wished she had been more leisurely. She would much rather have been the last to arrive than one of the first. After a moment's hesitation, she approached Lelaine. "Would you care to give an idea of why you called the hall?" Lelaine smiled down at her, an amused smile, yet unpleasant even so. "You might as well wait until we have enough sitters to proceed. I don't care to repeat myself. I will tell you this much. It will be dramatic." Her eyes drifted to the striped stole, and Ramonda felt a chill. She did not let it show, however, merely taking her bench across from Lelaine. She could not help glancing uneasily at the stole herself. Was this some move to unseat Egwene? It seemed unlikely the other woman could say anything that would convince her to stand for the greater consensus, or many of the other sitters, since that would throw them back to the struggle between her and Lelaine for control, and weaken their position against Elida. Yet Lelaine's air of confidence was unnerving. She schooled her features to calmness and waited. There was nothing else to do. Huamesa all but darted into the pavilion, her sharp-nosed face chagrined at not being first to arrive, and joined Delana. Salita appeared, dark and cool-eyed in yellow-slashed green embroidered with yellow scroll work on the bosom, and suddenly there was a rush. Lirella glided in, graceful and elegant in brocaded blue silk, to take her place with the blues. Then Soroya and Eledrin with their heads together, the blocky Damani seeming almost slender alongside the stout Tarabonner. As they took their places on the white benches, fox-faced Samalin joined Faisella and Malinde, and tiny Esmeralda scurried in. She scurried. The woman was from Farmatting, too. She should know better how to behave. "Verilyn is in Darine, I believe," Ramonda said as Esmeralda climbed out beside Janya. "But even if some others arrive later, we have more than 11. Are you content to begin, Lelaine, or do you wish to wait?" "I am content to begin. Do you wish a formal sitting?" Lelaine smiled again. She was being very free with those this morning. They did nothing to warm her face. "That won't be necessary, Ramonda." She rearranged her skirt slightly. "But I ask that what is said here be sealed to the hall for the time being." A murmur rose from the growing crowd of sisters standing behind the benches and those outside the pavilion. Even some of the sitters showed surprise. If the sitting was not formal, what need could there be to restrict knowledge of what was said so closely? Ramonda nodded as though it were the most reasonable request in the world, though. "Let all depart who do not hold a chair. Eledrin, will you make us private?" Despite dark yellow hair of a silky texture and large liquid brown eyes, the Tarabonner white fell short of pretty, but she had a good head on her shoulders, which was far more important. Standing, she seemed uncertain whether she should speak the formal words, and finally contented herself with weaving the ward against eavesdropping around the pavilion and holding it. The murmuring faded as sisters and warders passed through that ward, until the last was gone and silence fell. They stood in ranks, shoulder to shoulder on the walkway, watching, however. The warders all crowded to the rear so everyone could see. Adjusting her shawl, Lillian stood. A green sister was brought to me when she came asking for Egwene. The green sitters stirred, exchanging glances, no doubt wondering why the sister was not brought to them instead. Lillian affected not to notice. Not for the Amerlin seat. For Egwene Alvir. She has a proposal that meets some of our needs, though she was reluctant to say very much of it to me. Moria, will you bring her so she can present her proposal to the hall? She resumed her seat. Moria left the pavilion still frowning, and the crowd outside opened up enough to let her through. Ramonda could see sisters trying to question her, but she ignored them, disappearing across the street and into the blue Aja quarters. Ramonda had a dozen questions she would have liked to ask in the interval, but informal session or not, questions would have been improper at this point. The sitters did not wait in silence, however. At every Aja except the blue, women stepped down so they could come together and speak in low voices, except the blue and the yellow. Salita climbed down and walked over to Ramonda's platform, but Ramonda raised a hand slightly as soon as she opened her mouth. What is there to discuss? Until we know what the proposal is, Salita. The Tyrant Sitter's round face was as unreadable as a stone, but after a moment she nodded and resumed her seat. She was not unintelligent, far from it, just unsuitable. At last Moria returned, leading a tall woman in dark green, her dark hair pulled back severely from a stern, ivory face and held by a silver comb, and everyone climbed back to their benches. 3 men with swords at their hips trailed after her through the watching sisters and into the pavilion. Unusual, that. Very unusual when matters had been sealed to the hall. Ramonda paid them little mind at first, though. She had had no real interest in warders since her last had died a good many years earlier. But someone among the Greens gasped, and Eledrin squeaked. She actually squeaked. And she was staring at the warders. That had to be what they were, and not only because they were healing the Green. There was no mistaking a warder's deadly grace. Ramonda took a longer look and nearly gasped herself. They were disparate men, alike only in the way a leopard was like a leopard. But one, a pretty sun-dark boy with his hair in belled braids, garbed all in black, wore a pair of pins on the tall collar of his coat. A silver sword, and a sinuous maned creature in red and gold. She had heard enough descriptions to know she was looking at an Ashaman. An Ashaman who had been bonded, apparently. Gathering her skirts, Malind jumped down and rushed out into the crowd of sisters. Really, she was not frightened. Although Ramonda admitted to a hint of unease herself, if only to herself. You are not one of us, Janya said, speaking up where she should not, as always. She leaned forward, squinting at the new-come sister. Should I take it you have not come here to join us? Green's mouth twisted in obvious distaste. You take it correctly, she said in a strong Tarabonner accent. My name is Maurice Heimdall, and me I will stand with no sister who wishes to contend against other sisters while the world hangs in the balance. Our enemy, it is the shadow, not women who wear the shawl as we do. Mutters rose in the pavilion, some angry, some, Ramonda thought, shamed. If you disapprove of what we do, Janya went on, as if she had a right to speak before Ramonda, why do you bring us any sort of proposal? Because the dragon reborn, he asked Catswain, and Catswain, she asked me, Maurice replied. The dragon reborn? The tension in the hall was suddenly palpable, but the woman continued as if she were senseless to it. Properly, it is not my proposal. Jahar, speak to them. The sun-dark youth stepped forward, and as he passed her, Maurice reached up to pat him on the shoulder encouragingly. Romanda's respect for her rose. To bond an Ashaman was accomplishment enough. To pat one as you might a hunting hound took a level of courage and self-confidence she herself was unsure she possessed. The boy strode to the center of the pavilion, staring at the bench where the Armelin's stole lay, then turned about slowly, running his gaze over the sitters with an air of challenge. It came to Ramonda that he was unafraid too. An Aes Sedai held his bond. He was alone and surrounded by sisters, yet if there was a scrap of fear in him, he had it under complete control. "Where is Egwene Alvir?" he demanded. "I was ordered to lay the offer before her." "Manners, Jar," Maurice murmured, and his face colored. "The mother is unavailable at the moment," Ramonda said smoothly. "You can tell us, and we will tell her as soon as we can. This offer comes from the Dragon Reborn and Cadswain." But learning what that woman was doing in company with the Dragon Reborn was secondary. Instead of answering, he snarled and spun to face Maurice. "A man just tried to listen in," he said. "Or maybe it was that Forsaken who killed Eben." "He is right," Eledrin said, unsteady. "At least something touched my warding, and it wasn't Sidar." "He's channeling?" someone said incredulously. A flurry broke out of sitters shifting on the benches, and the light of the power enveloped several. Abruptly, Delana stood. "I need a breath of fresh air," she said, glowering at Jahar as though she wanted to rip his throat out. "There's no need to be uneasy," Ramonda said, though she was not sure herself. But Delana, wrapped in her shawl, hurried from the pavilion. Malind passed her coming in, as did Nacella, a tall, slender Malkieri, one of the handful remaining in the tower. A good many had died in the years after Malkier fell to the shadow, letting themselves be pulled into schemes to avenge their native land, and replacements had been few and far between since. Nacella was not particularly intelligent, but then Greens did not need intelligence, only courage. "This session has been sealed to the hall, Malind," Ramonda said sharply. "Nacella needs only moments," Malind replied, rubbing her hands together. Irritatingly, she did not even bother to look at Ramonda, keeping her eyes on the other Green. "This is her first chance to test a new weave. Go ahead, Nacella, try it." The glow of Sidar appeared around the slim Green. Shocking! The woman neither asked permission nor told them what weave she intended, although tight strictures held on what uses of the power were allowed in the hall. Channeling all of the 5 powers, she wove around the Ashaman something that seemed akin to the weave for detecting residues, a thing Ramonda had small facility for. Nacella's blue eyes widened. "He is channeling," she breathed. "Or at least holding Saidin." Ramonda's eyebrows climbed. Even Lilane gasped. Finding a man who could channel was
Give me
always
1
a
second, everyone will be right back.
what he had done, then arduously narrowing the suspects down to the true culprit. Or rather, it had been. This was truly wondrous. Or would have been, before men who could channel started wearing black coats and strutting around openly. Still, it negated one advantage those men had always had over Aes Sedai. The Ashaman seemed not to care. His lip curled in what might have been a sneer. "Can you tell what he is channeling?" she asked, and disappointingly, Nacella shook her head. "I thought I'd be able to, but no. On the other hand, you there, Ashaman! Extend a flow toward one of the sitters. Nothing dangerous, mind, and do not touch her." Maurice glowered at her, fists planted on her hips. Maybe Nacella failed to realize he was one of her warders. She certainly gestured at him in peremptory fashion. A stubborn cast to his eyes, Jahar opened his mouth. "Do it, Jahar," Maurice said. "He is mine, Nacella, but I will let you give him an order. This once." Nacella looked shocked. Apparently she had failed to realize. For the Ashaman's part, that stubborn look remained, yet he must have obeyed because Nacella clapped her hands delightedly and laughed. "Saroya!" she said excitedly. "You extended a flow toward Saroya!" The Damani White, am I right? Soroya's coppery skin paled, and gathering her white fringed shawl around her, she hastily slid back on her bench as far as she could. For that matter, Eledrin edged away on her own bench. Tell her, Maurice said. Jahar, he can be stubborn, but he is the good boy for all that. The Damani White, Jahar agreed reluctantly. Soroya swayed as if she were going to fall over, and he glanced at her contemptuously. It was only spirit, and it's gone now. Soroya's face darkened, but whether from anger or embarrassment, there was no telling. A remarkable discovery, Lelaine said. And I'm sure that Maurice will allow you to test further, Nacella, but the Hall has business to conclude. I'm certain you agree, Ramonda. Ramonda barely managed to stop herself from glaring. Lelaine overstepped herself too often. If your demonstration is at an end, she said, you may withdraw, Nacella. The Malchieri Green was reluctant to go, perhaps because she could tell from Maurice's expression that there would be no further testing. Really, you would think a Green of all people would be careful with any man who might be another sister's warder. Yet she had no choice, of course. What proposal does the Dragon Reborn have for us, boy? Ramonda asked, once Nacella was on the other side of the warding. This, he said, facing her proudly. Any sister who is faithful to Egwene Alvir may bond an Ashaman to a total of 47. You cannot ask for the Dragon Reborn, nor any man who wears the dragon, but any soldier or dedicated you ask cannot refuse. Ramonda felt as if all the breath had been squeezed from her lungs. You will agree this meets our needs, Lelaine said calmly. The woman must have known the gist of it from the start. Burn her. I do, Ramonda replied. With 47 men who could channel, surely they could expand their circles as far as they would go. Perhaps even a circle that included all of them. If there were limits, they would need to be worked out. Priscilla popped to her feet as if this were a formal sitting. This must be sufficient. I call for a full session. I see no need for that, Ramonda said without rising. This is much better than what we previously agreed on. Saying too much in front of the boy, or Maurice. What was her connection to the Dragon Reborn? Could she be one of the sisters, said to have sworn oaths to him? Soroya was on her feet before the last word left Ramonda's mouth. There is still the question of covenants, to be sure we are in control. We still have not agreed on those. I should think the warder bond will make any other covenants moot, Lirella said dryly. Faisella rose hurriedly, and she and Soroya spoke atop one another. The taint... They stopped, staring at each other suspiciously. Saidin is clean, Jahar said, though no one had addressed him. Maurice really should teach the boy how to behave, if she was going to bring him before the hall. Clean? Soroya said derisively. It has been tainted for more than 3,000 years, Faisella put in sharply. How can it be clean? Order, Ramonda snapped, trying to regain control. Order! She stared at Soroya and Faisella until they resumed their seats, then turned her attention to Maurice. Can I assume that you have linked with him? The Green simply nodded once. She really did not like her present company and did not want to say a word more than necessary. Can you say that Saidin is free of the taint? The woman did not hesitate. I can. I took time to be convinced. The male half of the power, it is more alien than you can imagine. Not the inexorable yet gentle power of Saidar, but rather a raging sea of fire and ice, whipped by a tempest. Yet I am convinced it is clean. Ramonda let out a long breath, a marvel to balance some of the horrors. We are not formal, but I call the question. Who stands to accept this offer? She was on her feet as soon as she finished, but no faster than Lelaine, and Janya beat both of them. In moments, everyone was on her feet save Soroya and Faisella. Outside the warding, heads turned as sisters doubtless began discussing what might have just been voted on. The lesser consensus standing, the offer to bond 47 Ashaman is accepted. Soroya's shoulders slumped, and Faisella exhaled heavily. She called for the greater consensus in the name of unity, but it did not surprise her when the pair remained firmly on their benches. After all, they had fought approaching the Ashaman at every turn, struggled despite law and custom to impede it even after it had been decided on. In any event, it was done, and without need of even a temporary alliance. Bonding would last a lifetime, of course, yet it was better than any sort of alliance. That implied too much equality. A peculiar number, 47, Janya mused. May I question your warder, Maurice? Thank you. How did the Dragon Reborn come to that number, Jahar? A very good question, Ramonda thought. In the shock of achieving what they needed without any requirement for partnership, it had eluded her. Jahar drew himself up as if he had anticipated this, and dreaded answering. His face remained hard and cold, though. 51 sisters have been bonded by Ashaman already, and 4 of us are bonded to Aes Sedai. 47 makes the difference. There were 5 of us, but 1 died defending his Aes Sedai. Remember his name. Eben Hopwell. Remember him. There was a stunned silence from the benches. Ramonda felt a lump of ice in her middle. 51 sisters? Bonded by Ashaman? It was an abomination. Manners, Jahar, Maurice snapped. Do not make me tell you again. Shockingly, he rounded on her. They need to know, Maurice. They need to know. Looking back, he ran his gaze along the benches. His eyes seemed hot. He had been dreading nothing. He had been angry and still was. Eben was linked with his Daigyan and Beldane, with Daigyan controlling the link. So when they found themselves facing one of the Forsaken, all he could do was shout, "She's channeling Saidin," and attack her with his sword. And despite what she did to him, ruined as he was, he managed to hang on to life. Hang on to Saidin, long enough for Daigyan to drive her off. So you remember his name, Eben Hopwell. He fought for his Aes Sedai long after he should have been dead. When he fell silent, no one spoke until Esmeralda finally said, very quietly, "We will remember him, Jahar. But how did 51 sisters come to be bonded to Ashaman?" She leaned forward. His answer would be pitched as low. The boy shrugged, still angry. It was of no matter to him. Ashaman bonding Aes Sedai. Elida sent them to destroy us. The Dragon Reborn has a standing order that no Aes Sedai can be harmed unless she tries to harm one of us first. So Taim decided to capture and bond them before they had the chance. So, they were Elida's supporters. Should that make a difference? Somehow it did, a little. But any sisters held by Ashaman brought it all back to a matter of equality, and that was intolerable. "I have another question for him, Maurice," Moria said, and waited until the green nodded. "Twice now you did speak as if a woman did channel Saidin. Why? That do be impossible." Murmurs of agreement rippled around the pavilion. "It might be impossible," the boy replied coolly, "but she did it. Daigyan told us what Eben said, and she couldn't detect anything at all, even while the woman was channeling. It had to be Saidin." Suddenly that small chime sounded again in the back of Ramonda's head, and she knew where she had heard the name Cabriana McCandis. "We must order the arrest of Delana and Halima immediately," she said. She had to explain, of course. Not even the Amerlin seat could order the arrest of a sitter without explanation. The murders with Saidin of 2 sisters who had been close friends of Cabriana, a woman Halima had claimed friendship with as well. A female Forsaken who channeled the male half of the power. They were hardly convinced, especially Lelaine, not until a thorough search of the camp turned up no trace of either woman. They had been seen walking toward one of the traveling grounds, with Delana and her serving woman both carrying large bundles and scurrying along behind Halima. But they were gone. Chapter 24. Honey in the Tea. Egwene knew from the start that her strange captivity would be difficult, yet she believed that embracing pain as the Aiel did would be the easiest part. After all, she had been beaten severely when she paid her toke to the Wise Ones for lying, strapped by one after another in turn, so she had experience. But embracing pain did not mean just giving way to it rather than fighting. You had to draw the pain inside of you and welcome it as a part of you. Avienda said you must be able to smile and laugh with joy or sing while the worst of the pain still gripped you. That was not so easy at all.
Excuse me.
That first morning before dawn in Sylviana's study, she did her best while the mistress of novices plied a hard-soled slipper on her bared bottom. She made no effort to stifle her sobs when they came, or later her wordless howls. When her legs wanted to kick, she allowed them to flail until the mistress of novices trapped them under one of hers, awkwardly because of Sylviana's skirts. And then she let her toes drum the floor while her head tossed wildly. She tried to draw the pain inside her, to drink it in like breath. Pain was as much a part of life as breathing. That was how the Aiel saw life. But oh, light, it hurt! When she was finally allowed to straighten after what seemed a very long time, she flinched when her shift and dress fell against her flesh. The white wool seemed heavy as lead. She attempted to welcome the scalding heat. It was hard, though, so very hard. Still, it seemed that her sobbing stopped very quickly of its own accord, and her flow of tears dried out rapidly. She did not snivel or writhe. She studied herself in the mirror on the wall with its fading gilt. How many thousands of women had peered into that mirror over the years? Those who were disciplined in this room were always required to study their own reflection afterward and think over why they had been punished. But that was not why she did it. Her face was still red, yet already it looked calm. Despite the painful heat in her bottom, she actually felt calm. Perhaps she should try singing? Perhaps not. Plucking a white linen handkerchief from her sleeve, she carefully dried her cheeks. Sylviana studied her with a look of satisfaction before replacing the slipper in the narrow cabinet opposite the mirror. "I think I got your attention from the start, or I'd have gone harder," she said dryly, patting the bun on the back of her head. "I doubt I will see you again soon, in any case. You may like to know that I asked questions as you requested." Melaire had already begun asking. "The woman is Liana Sharif, though the like knows how." Trailing off, shaking her head, she pulled her chair back around behind the writing table and sat. "She was most anxious about you, more so than about herself. You may visit her in your free time, if you have any free time. I'll give instructions. She's in the open cells. And now you had better run if you want anything to eat before your first class." "Thank you," Egwene said, and turned toward the door. Sylviana sighed heavily. "No curtsy, child?" Dipping her pen in the silver-mounted ink jar, she began to write in the punishment ledger, a neat, precise hand. "I will see you at midday. It seems you will eat both of your first 2 meals back in the tower, standing." Egwene could have left it there, but in the night, while waiting for the sitters to gather in the hall in Tel Riad, she had decided on the fine line she must walk. She meant to fight, yet she had to do it while appearing to go along, to some extent at least, within the limits she set herself. Refusing every order would mean appearing merely obstinate, and perhaps would get her confined to a cell where she would be useless. But some commands she must not obey if she was to maintain any scrap of dignity, and that she had to do, more than scraps. She could not allow them to deny who she was, however hard they insisted. "The Amerlin seat curtsies to no one," she said calmly, knowing full well the reaction she would get. Sylviana's face hardened, and she took up her pen again. "I will see you at the dinner hour as well. I suggest you leave without speaking further, unless you wish to end spending the entire day over my knee." Egwene left without speaking, and without curtsying. A fine line, like a wire suspended over a deep pit, but she had to walk it. To her surprise, Alviarin was pacing up and down in the hall outside, wrapped in her white-fringed shawl and hugging herself, staring at something in the unseen distance. She knew the woman was no longer Elida's keeper, if not why she had been removed so suddenly. Spying in Tel'aran'rhiod gave only glimpses and snatches. It was an uncertain reflection of the waking world in so many ways. Alviarin must have heard her yowling, but strangely, Egwene felt no shame. She was fighting an odd battle, and in battle you took wounds. The normally icy white did not appear so cool today. In fact, she seemed quite agitated, her lips parted and her eyes hot. Egwene offered her no courtesies, yet Alviarin only gave her a baleful glare before entering Sylviana's study. A fine line. A little down the corridor, a pair of Reds stood watching, one round-faced, the other slender, both cool-eyed, with shawls draped along their arms so the long red fringe was displayed prominently. Not the same pair who had been there when she woke, but they were not present by happenstance. They were not precisely guards, and then again they were not precisely not guards either. She did not curtsy to these either. They watched her without expression. Before she had taken more than half a dozen steps along the red and green floor tiles, she heard a woman's pained howling start up behind her, hardly muffled at all by the heavy door to Sylviana's study. So Alviarin was taking a penance, and not doing well to be shrieking at the top of her lungs so soon, unless she also was trying to embrace pain, which seemed unlikely. Egwene wished she knew why Alviarin was undergoing penance, if it was an imposed penance. A general had scouts and eyes and ears to inform him on his enemy. She had only her own eyes and her own ears, and what little she could learn in the unseen world. Any scrap of knowledge might prove useful, though, so she must dig for every one possible. Breakfast or no breakfast, she returned to her tiny room in the novice quarters long enough to wash her face in cool water at the washstand and comb her hair. That comb, which had been in her belt pouch, was among the few personal belongings she retained. In the night, the clothes she had been wearing when captured vanished, replaced by novice white. But the dresses and shifts that hung from pegs on the white wall truly were hers. Stored away when she was raised accepted, they still carried small tags stitched with her name sewn into their hems. The tower was never wasteful. You never knew when a new girl would fit an old set of clothes. But having nothing to wear save novice white did not make her a novice, whatever Elida and the others believed. Not until she was sure that her face was no longer red, and she looked as collected as she felt, did she leave. When you had few weapons, your appearance could be one. The same two Reds were waiting on the railed gallery to shadow her. The dining hall, where novices ate, lay on the lowest level of the tower, to one side of the main kitchen. It was a large, white-walled chamber, plain, though the floor tiles showed all the Aja colors, and filled with tables, each of which could accommodate 6 or 8 women on small benches. 100 or more white-clad women were sitting at those tables, chattering away over breakfast. Elida must be very set up over their number. The tower had not held so many novices in years. Doubtless even news of the tower breaking had been enough to put the thought of going to Tar Valon into some heads. Egwene was not impressed. These women filled barely half the dining hall, if that, and there was another like it one floor up, closed now for centuries. Once she gained the tower, that second kitchen would be opened again, and the novices still would need to eat by shifts. Something unknown since well before the Trolloc Wars. Nicola caught sight of her as soon as she walked in. The woman appeared to have been watching for her, and nudged the novices to either side. Silence slid across the tables in a wave, and every head turned as Egwene glided down the central aisle. She looked neither to left nor right. Halfway to the kitchen door, a short, slim novice with long, dark hair suddenly stuck out a foot and tripped her. Catching her balance just short of falling on her face, she turned coolly. Another skirmish. The young woman had the pale look of a Kyrian, and this close, Egwene could be sure that she would be tested for accepted unless she had other failings. But the tower was good at rooting out such things. "What is your name?" she said. "Alvistair," the young woman replied, her accent confirming her face. Why do you want to know? So you can carry tales to Sylviana? It will do you no good. Everyone will say they saw nothing. A pity that, Alvis dear. You want to become Aes Sedai and give up the ability to lie, yet you want others to lie for you. Do you see any inconsistency in that? Alvastir's face reddened. Who are you to lecture me? I am the Amerlin seat. A prisoner, but still the Amerlin seat. Alvastir's big eyes widened, and whispers buzzed through the room as Egwene walked on to the kitchen. They had not believed she would still claim the title while garbed in white and sleeping among them. As well to disabuse them of that notion so quickly. The kitchen was a large, high-ceilinged room with grey-tiled floors, where the roasting spits in the long stone fireplace were still, but the iron stoves and ovens radiated enough heat that she would have begun perspiring immediately, had she not known how to ignore it. She had labored in this kitchen often enough, and it seemed certain she would again. Dining halls surrounded it on 3 sides, for the accepted and for Aes Sedai as well as novices. Laras, the mistress of the kitchens, was waddling about, sweaty-faced, in a spotless white apron that could have made 3 novice dresses, waving her long wooden spoon like a scepter as she directed cooks and undercooks and scullions, who scurried for her as fast as they would have for any queen, perhaps faster. A queen would be unlikely to give anyone a smack with her scepter for moving too slowly. A great deal of the food seemed to be going on to trays, sometimes worked silver, sometimes carved wood, and perhaps gilded, that women carried away through the door to the sisters' main dining hall. Not kitchen-serving women with the white flame of Tar Valon on their bosoms, but dignified women in well-cut woolens with an occasional touch of embroidery, sisters' personal servants, who would make the long climb back to the Aja quarters. Any Aes Sedai could eat in her own rooms if she wished, though it meant channeling to warm the food again, yet most enjoyed company at meals. At least they had. That steady stream of women carrying out cloth-covered trays was a confirmation that the White Tower was spider-webbed with cracks. She should have felt pleasure at that.
Be right back.
Elida stood on a platform that was ready to crumble beneath her. But the tower was home. All she felt was sadness, and anger at Elida, too. That one deserved to be pulled down simply for what she had done to the tower since gaining the stolen staff. Laras gave her one long look, drawing in her chin until she had a 4th, then returned to brandishing her spoon and looking over an undercook's shoulder. The woman had helped Swan and Lyanna escape once, so her loyalties to Elida were weak. Would she help another now? She was certainly making every effort to avoid looking in Egwene's direction again. Another undercook who likely did not know her from any other novice, a smiling woman still working on her 2nd chin, handed her a wooden tray with a large, stout cup of steaming tea and a thick white glazed plate of bread, olives, and crumbly white cheese that she carried back into the dining hall. Silence fell again, and once more every eye centered on her. Of course. They knew she had been summoned to the mistress of novices. They were waiting to see whether she would eat standing. She wanted very much to ease herself onto the hard wooden bench, but she made herself sit down normally, which reignited the flames, of course. Not as strongly as before, yet strong enough to make her shift before she could stop herself. Strangely, she felt no real desire to grimace or squirm. To stand, yes, but not the other. The pain was part of her. She accepted it without struggle. She tried to welcome it, yet that still seemed beyond her. She tore a piece of bread. There were weevils in the flour here, too, it appeared. And slowly the conversation in the room started up again, quietly because novices were expected not to make too much noise. At her table also the talk resumed, though no one made any effort to include her. That was just as well. She was not here to make friends among the novices, nor to have them see her as one of themselves. No, her purpose was far different. Leaving the hall with the novices after returning her tray to the kitchen, she found another pair of reds waiting for her. One was Katarina al-Ruddin, vulpine and copiously red-slashed gray, a mass of raven hair falling in waves to her waist, and her shawl looped over her elbows. "Drink this," Katerina said imperiously, extending a pewter cup in one slim hand. "All of it, mind." The other, red, dark and square-faced, adjusted her shawl impatiently and grimaced. Apparently she disliked acting as a serving woman even by association, or perhaps it was dislike for what was in the cup. Suppressing a sigh, Egwene drank. The weak fork-root tea looked and tasted like water tinged a faint brown, with just a hint of mint. Almost a memory of mint, rather than the taste itself. Her first cup had been soon after waking, the Red Sisters on duty eager to be done with shielding and about their own business. Katerina had let the hours slip a little, yet even without this cup, she doubted she would have been able to channel very strongly for some time yet. Certainly not with enough strength to be useful. "I don't want to be late for my first class," she said, handing the cup back. Katerina took it, though she seemed surprised to realize that she had. Egwene glided on after the novices before the sister could object, or remember to call her down for failing to curtsy. That first class, in a plain windowless room where 10 novices occupied benches for 30 or more, was every bit the disaster she expected. Not a disaster for her, however, no matter the outcome. The instructor was Idrella Menford, a lanky, hard-eyed woman who had already been accepted when Egwene first came to the tower. She still wore the white dress with the 7 bands of color at hem and cuffs. Egwene took a seat at the end of a bench, once again without consideration for her tenderness. That had lessened, though not very far. Drink in the pain. Standing on a small dais at the front of the room, Idrella looked down her long nose with more than a spark of satisfaction at seeing Egwene in white once more. It almost softened her frown, a fixture with Idrella. "You have all gone beyond making simple balls of fire," she told the class. "But let's see what our new girl is capable of. She used to think a great deal of herself, you know." Several of the novices tittered. "Make a ball of fire, Egwene. Go on, child." A ball of fire? That was one of the earliest things novices learned. What was she about? Opening herself to the source, Egwene embraced Saidar, let it rush into her. The fork-root allowed only a trickle, a thread where she was accustomed to torrents, yet it was the power. And trickle or no, it brought all of the life and joy of Saidar, all the heightened awareness of herself and the room around her. Awareness of herself meant her smarting bottom suddenly felt freshly slippered again, but she did not shift. Breathe in the pain. She could smell the faint aroma of soap from the novice's morning wash, see a tiny vein pulsing on Idrella's forehead. Part of her wanted to clout the woman's ear with a flow of air, but given the amount of power she commanded now, Idrella would barely feel it. Instead, she channeled fire and air to produce a small ball of green fire that floated in front of her. A pale, pitiful thing it was, actually transparent. "Very good," Idrella said sarcastically. Ah, yes. She had just wanted to begin by showing the novices how weak Egwene's channeling was. "Release, Saidar. Now, class." Egwene added a blue ball, then a brown and a gray, making them spin around each other. "Release the source," Idrella said brusquely. A yellow ball joined the others, a white, and finally a red ball. Quickly she added rings of fire, one inside the other, around the whirling balls. Red came first this time because she wanted it smallest, green last and largest. Had she been able to choose an Aja, it would have been the green. 7 rings of fire rotated, no 2 in the same direction, around 7 balls of fire that carried out an intricate dance at the heart. Pale and thin they might be, yet it was an impressive display beyond dividing her flows 14 ways. Juggling with the power was not all that much easier than juggling with your hands. "Stop that!" Idrella shouted. "Stop it!" The glow of Saidar enveloped the teacher, and a switch of air struck Egwene hard across the back. "I said stop it!" The switch struck again, then again. Egwene calmly kept the rings spinning, the balls dancing. After Sylviana's hard-swung slipper, it was easy to drink in the pain of Idrella's blows, if not to welcome it. Would she ever be able to smile while she was being beaten? Katerina and the other Red appeared in the doorway. "What is going on in here?" the raven-haired sister demanded. Her companion's eyes widened when she saw what Egwene was doing. It was very unlikely that either of them could divide their flows so far. The novices all popped to their feet and curtsied when the Aes Sedai entered, of course. Egwene remained seated. Idrella spread her banded skirts, looking flustered. "She won't stop," she wailed. "I told her to, but she won't." "Stop that, Egwene," Katerina ordered firmly. Egwene maintained her weaves until the woman opened her mouth again. Only then did she release Saidar and stand. Katerina's mouth snapped shut, and she took a deep breath. Her face retained its Aes Sedai serenity, but her eyes glittered. "You will run to Sylviana's study and tell her that you disobeyed your instructor and disrupted a class. Go." Pausing long enough to straighten her skirts, when she obeyed, she must not do so with any appearance of eagerness or haste. Egwene squeezed past the two Aes Sedai and glided up the hallway. "I told you to run," Katerina said sharply behind her. A flow of air struck her still sensitive bottom. Accept the pain. Another blow. Drink in the pain like breath. A third, hard enough to stagger her. Welcome the pain. "Unhand me, Jezreel," Katerina snarled. "I'll do no such thing," the other sister said with a strong tyrant accent. "You go too far, Katerina. A swat or two is permitted, but punishing her further belongs to the mistress of novices. Light at this rate you'll leave her unable to walk before she reaches Sylviana." Katerina breathed heavily. "Very well," she said at last. "But she can add disobeying a sister to her list of offenses. I will inquire, Egwene, so don't think you can let it slip your mind." When she stepped into the mistress of novices' study, Sylviana's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Again so soon? Fetch the slipper from the cabinet, child, and tell me what you've done now." After 2 more classes and 2 more visits to Sylviana's study, she refused to be made mock of, and if an accepted did not want her doing a thing better than the accepted herself could, the woman should not ask her to do it at all. Plus her foreordained midday appointment between, the stern-faced woman decided that she was to have healing to begin each day. "Else you'll soon be too bruised to spank without bringing blood. But don't think this means I'm going easy on you. If you require healing 3 times a day, I'll just spank all the harder to make up. If need be, I'll go to the strap or the switch. Because I will make your head straight, child. Believe me on that." Those 3 classes, leaving 3 very embarrassed accepted, had another result. Her teaching was shifted to sessions alone with Aes Sedai, something normally reserved for accepted. That meant climbing the long tapestry-lined spiraling corridors to the Aja quarters, where sisters stood at the entrances like guards. They were guards, in truth. Visitors from other Ajas were unwelcome, to say the least. In fact, she never saw any Aes Sedai near the quarters of another Aja. Except for sitters, she seldom saw sisters in the hallways outside the quarters other than in groups, always wearing their shawls, usually with warders following close behind. But this was not like the fear that gripped the encampment outside the walls. Here it was always sisters of the same Aja together, and when 2 groups passed, they cut each other dead if they did not glare. In the worst of summer, the tower remained cool, yet the air seemed feverish and gelid when sisters of different Ajas came too close. Even the sitters she recognized walked quickly. The few who realized who she was gave her a long, studying look, but most appeared distracted. Avara Tazanovni, a plumply pretty sitter for the Red, almost walked into her one day. She was not going to jump aside, even for sitters, but Pavara hurried on as if she had not noticed. Another time, Doacine Alwayn, boyishly slim if elegantly dressed, did the same while deep in conversation with another yellow sister. Neither glanced at her twice. She wished she had some idea who the other yellow was. She knew the names of the 10 ferrets Shiriam and the others had sent into the tower to try undermining Elida, and she very much would have liked to make contact with them, but she did not know their faces, and asking after them would only draw attention to them. She hoped one of them would pull her aside or hand her a note, but none did. Her battle would have to be fought alone except for Liana, unless she overheard something that put faces to some of those names. She did not neglect Liana, of course. Her second night back in the tower, she went down to the open cells after supper despite her bone-deep weariness. Those half-dozen rooms in the first basement were where women who could channel were held, if not to be closely confined. Each held a large cage of iron latticework that ran from stone floor to stone ceiling, with a space around it 4 paces wide and iron stand lamps to provide light. At Liana's cell, 2 Browns were sitting on benches against the wall with a warder, a wide-shouldered man with a beautiful face and touches of white at his temples. He looked up when Egwene walked in, then returned to honing his dagger on a stone. One of the Browns was Falana Bevane, slender with long yellow hair that gleamed as if she brushed it several times a day. She stopped writing in a leather-bound notebook on a lap desk long enough to say in a raspy voice, "Oh, it's you, is it? Well, Sylviana said you can visit, child, but don't give her anything without showing it to Delevian or me, and don't make any fuss." She promptly returned to her writing. Delevian, a stocky woman with gray streaking her short dark hair, never looked up from her comparison of the text of 2 books, one held open on either knee. The glow of Saidar shone around her, and she was maintaining a shield on Liana, but there was no reason for her to look once it had been woven. Egwene lost no time in rushing to thrust her hand through the iron latticework and clasp Liana's. "Sylviana told me they finally believe who you are," she said, laughing. "But I didn't expect to find you in such luxury." It was luxury only when held up alongside the small, dark cells where a sister might be held for trial, with rushes on the floor for a mattress, and a blanket only if you were lucky. Yet Liana's accommodations did appear reasonably comfortable. She had a small bed that looked softer than those in the novice quarters, a ladder-back chair with a tasseled blue cushion, and a table that held 3 books, and a tray with the remains of her supper. There was even a washstand, though the white pitcher and bowl both had chips, and the mirror was bubbled, and a privacy screen, opaque enough that she would be only a shadowy shape behind it, hid the chamber pot. Liana laughed, too. "Oh, I'm very popular," she said briskly. Even the way she stood seemed languorous, the very image of a seductive Damani despite plain dark woolens, but that brisk voice remained from before she had decided to remake herself as she wanted to be. "I've had a steady stream of visitors all day, from every Aja except the Red. Even the Greens tried to convince me to teach them how to travel, and they mainly want to get their hands on me because I claim to be green now." She shivered much too ostentatiously for it to be real. "That would be as bad as being back with Malaire and Desala. Dreadful woman, Desala." Her smile faded away like mist in a noonday sun. "They told me they'd put you in white. Better than the alternatives, I suppose. They give you fork root? Me too." Surprised, Egwene glanced toward the sister holding the shield, and Liana snorted. "Custom. If I weren't shielded, I could swat a fly and not hurt it. But custom says a woman in the open cells is always shielded. But they just let you wander around otherwise?" "Not exactly," Egwene said dryly. "There are 2 Reds waiting outside to escort me to my room and shield me while I sleep." Liana sighed. "So, I'm in a cell, you're being watched, and we're both full of fork root tea." She cast a sidelong look at the 2 Browns. Falana was still intent on her writing. Delevian turned pages in the 2 books on her knees and began muttering under her breath. The warder must have intended to shave with that dagger, he was honing it so keen. His main attention seemed to be on the doorway, though. Liana lowered her voice. "So when do we escape?" "We don't," Egwene told her, and related her reasons and her plan in a near whisper while watching the sisters out of the corner of her eye. She told Liana everything she had seen and done. It was hard to tell how many times she had been spanked that day, and how she had behaved during, but necessary to convince the other woman that she would not be broken. I can see any sort of raid is out of the question, but I had hoped. The warder shifted, and Liana cut off, but he was merely sheathing his dagger. Folding his arms across his chest and stretching his legs out, he leaned back against the wall, his eyes on the doorway. He looked as if he could be on his feet in the blink of an eye. Laris helped me escape once, she went on softly, but I don't know that she would do it again. She shivered, and there was nothing fake about it this time. She had been stilled when Laris helped her and Swan to escape. She did it for men more than for Swan or me, anyway. Are you certain about this? A hard woman, Sylviana Brehan. Fair, so I hear, but hard enough to break iron. Are you absolutely certain, Mother? When Egwene said that she was, Liana sighed again. Well, we'll be two worms gnawing at the root then, won't we? It was not a question. She visited Liana every night that exhaustion failed to drag her to her bed straight after supper, and found her astonishingly sanguine for a prisoner confined to a cell. Liana's stream of visiting sisters was continuing, and she slipped the tidbits Egwene suggested into every conversation. Those visitors could not order an Aes Sedai punished, even one held in the open cells, though a few grew angry enough to wish they could. And besides, hearing those things from a sister carried more weight than hearing them from one they saw as a novice. Liana could even argue openly, at least until the visitors stalked out. But she reported that many did not. A few agreed with her. Cautiously, hesitantly, perhaps on one point and not others, but they agreed. Almost as important, to Liana at least, some of the Greens decided that since she had been stilled and thus was no longer Aes Sedai for a time, she had the right to ask admission to any Aja once she was a sister again. Not all, by any means, but few was better than none. Egwene began to think that Liana in her cell was having more effect than she was roaming free. Well, free after a fashion. She was not exactly jealous. This was important work they were doing, and it did not matter which of them did it better so long as it got done. But there were times when it made the trek to Sylviana's study much harder. Still, she had successes, of a sort. That first afternoon, in Ben Alsad's cluttered sitting room, books stood in haphazard stacks everywhere on the floor tiles, and the shelves were full of bones and skulls and the preserved skins of animals, birds, and snakes, along with stuffed examples of some of the smaller specimens. A large brown lizard was perched on the huge skull of a bear, so still you would have thought it stuffed as well, until it blinked. That first afternoon, the Shinar and Brown asked her to perform an exhaustive set of weaves, one after the other. Then I sat in a high-backed chair on one side of the brown-streaked marble fireplace, she, with decided discomfort, in one on the other. She had not been invited to sit, but neither had Ben-I objected. Egwene performed each weave as asked, until Ben-I casually asked for the weave for traveling, and then she merely smiled and folded her hands in her lap. The sister leaned back and adjusted her deep brown silk skirts a hair. Ben-I's eyes were blue and sharp, her dark hair caught in a silver net, liberally streaked with gray. Ink stains marked two of her fingers, and another smudged the side of her nose. She held a porcelain cup of tea, but she had not offered any to Egwene. I think there is little of the power that remains for you to learn, child, especially considering your wonderful discoveries. Egwene inclined her head, accepting the compliment. Some of those things truly were her discoveries, and it hardly mattered now in any case. But that hardly means you have nothing to learn. You had few novice classes before you were... The Brown frowned at Egwene's white dress and cleared her throat. And fewer lessons as... well, later. Tell me, if you can, what mistakes did Shine Chunla make that caused the Third War of Garen's Wall? What were the causes of the Great Winter War between Andor and Kyrian? What caused the Wykin Rebellion, and how did it end? Most of history seems to be the study of wars, and the important parts of that are how and why they began and how and why ended. A great many wars would never have taken place if people had paid attention to the mistakes others had made. Well, Shine didn't make any mistakes, Egwene said slowly. But you're right, I do have a lot to learn. I don't even know the names of those other wars. Rising, she poured herself a cup of tea from the silver pitcher on the side table. Aside from the ropework silver tray, the tabletop held a stuffed lynx and the skull of a serpent. That was as big as a man's skull. Ben-I frowned, but not for the tea. She hardly seemed to notice that. What do you mean Shine didn't make any mistakes, child? Why, she bungled the situation as badly as ever I've heard of. Well before the Third War of Garen's Wall, Egwene said, returning to her chair. Shine was doing exactly as the Hall told her, and nothing they didn't. She might be lacking in other areas of history, but Swan had tutored her thoroughly in the mistakes made by other Amelins, and this particular question gave her an opening. Sitting down normally took a great effort. What are you talking about? She tried running the tower with an iron hand, never a compromise on anything, running roughshod over any opposition. The Hall grew tired of it, but they couldn't settle on a replacement. So rather than deposing her, they did worse. They left her in place and forced a penance on her whenever she tried to issue an order of any kind. Any kind at all. She knew she was going on, sounding as if she were the one giving a lecture, but she had to get it all out. Not easing herself on the hard wood of the chair seat was difficult. Welcome the pain. The Hall ran Shine and the tower, but they mishandled a great deal themselves, largely because each Aja had its own goals, and there was no hand to shape them into a goal for the tower. Shine's reign was marked by wars all over the map. Eventually, the sisters themselves got tired of the Hall's bungling. In one of the 6 mutinies in Tower history, Shine and the Hall were pulled down. I know she supposedly died in the Tower of natural causes, but in fact she was smothered in her bed in exile 51 years later after the discovery of a plot to put her back on the Amerlin seat. Mutinies? Ben-I said incredulously. 6 of them? Exiled and smothered? It's all recorded in the secret histories, in the 13th depository. No, I suppose I shouldn't have told you that. Egwene took a sip of tea and grimaced. It was all but rancid. No wonder Ben-I had not touched hers. Secret histories? A 13th depository? If such a thing existed, and I think I would know, why should you not have told me? Because by law, the existence of the secret histories as well as their contents can be known only to the Amerlin, the Keeper, and the Sitters. Them and the librarians who keep the records, anyway. Even the law itself is part of the 13th depository, so I guess I shouldn't have told that either. But if you can gain access somehow, or ask someone who knows and will tell you, you'll find out I'm right. 6 times in the history of the tower when the Amerlin was dangerously divisive or dangerously incompetent, and the Hall failed to act, sisters have risen up to remove her. There. She could not have planted the seed deeper with a shovel, or driven it home more bluntly with a hammer. And I stared at her for a long moment, then raised the cup to her lips. She spluttered as soon as the tea touched her tongue and began dabbing at the spots on her dress with a delicate lace-edged handkerchief. The great winter war, she said huskily as she set the cup on the floor beside her chair, began late in the year 671. She did not mention secret records or mutinies again, but she did not have to. More than once during the lesson she trailed off, frowning at something beyond Egwene, and Egwene had little doubt what it was. Later that day, Lyrene Dwarelin said, "Yes, Elida made a vital mistake there," pacing up and down in front of her sitting room's fireplace. The Kyrianan sister was only a little shorter than Egwene, but the nervous way her eyes darted gave her the air of a hunted thing, a sparrow fearful of cats, and convinced there were lots of cats in the vicinity. Her dark green skirts had only 4 discreet slashes of red, though she had been a sitter once. That proclamation of hers on top of trying to kidnap him could not have been better calculated to keep the Althor boy as far from the tower as he can stay. Oh, she has made mistakes, Elida has. Egwene wanted to ask about Rand and kidnapping. Kidnapping? But Lyrene left no opening as she went on about Elida's many mistakes, all the while pacing back and forth, her eyes darting and her hands twisting unconsciously. Egwene was unsure whether or not that session could be called a success, but at least it was not a failure, and she had learned something. Not all of her forays went so well, of course. This is not a discussion, Pratella Narbyjon said. Her tone was utterly calm, yet her tilted green eyes were heated. Her room looked more those of a green than a yellow, with several bared swords hanging on the walls, and a silk tapestry showing men fighting Trollocs. She was gripping the hilt of the dagger at her woven silver belt. Not a simple belt knife. A dagger with a blade near a foot long and an emerald capping its pommel. Why she had agreed to lecture Egwene was a mystery given her dislike of teaching. Perhaps because it was Egwene. You are here for a lesson on the limits of power. A very basic lesson, suitable for a novice. Egwene wanted to shift on the three-legged stool that Pratella had given her for a seat, but instead she concentrated on the smarting, focused on drinking it in, on welcoming it. The day had already seen 3 visits to Sylviana, and she could sense a 4th coming, with the midday meal an hour off yet. I merely said that if Shamarin could be reduced from Aes Sedai to accepted, then Elida's power has no limits. At least she thinks it doesn't. But if you accept that, then it really doesn't. Pratalla's grip tightened on the dagger's hilt until her knuckles showed white, yet she seemed unaware. Since you think you know better than I, she said coolly, you can visit Sylviana when we finish. A partial success, perhaps. Egwene did not think Pratalla's anger was for her. I expect proper behavior out of you, Saranja Colvine told her firmly another day.
What happened?
Those that constantly
Got to charge my battery again, but that, all right, everyone, got to call into his life for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone, y'all stay safe.